Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un have wrapped up an historic summit in Singapore, where they pledged to work toward complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. The summit marked the first-ever meeting between a sitting U.S. president and a North Korean leader. Following the historic meeting, President Trump announced the end of U.S.-South Korean war games.
We'll be stopping the war games, which will save us a tremendous amount of money, unless and until we see that the future negotiation is not going along like it should. But we'll be saving a tremendous amount of money. Plus, I think it's very provocative.
That was President Trump speaking at a news conference early this morning. It was his first full news conference in more than a year. Trump also expressed hope for an end to the Korean conflict.
An extremely bloody conflict ravaged the Korean peninsula. Countless people died in the conflict, including tens of thousands of brave Americans. Yet while the armistice was agreed to, the war never ended, to this day, never ended. But now we can all have hope that it will soon end, and it will soon end. The past does not have to define the future.
After headlines, we'll go to Singapore for more on this historic meeting between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. In major immigration news, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced Monday domestic violence will no longer be grounds for asylum, a far-reaching shift that could affect thousands of women fleeing gender-based violence, particularly from Central America. Sessions overturned a precedent set in a 2014 Immigration Appeals Court ruling that had granted asylum to a Guatemalan woman named Aminta Cifuentes, who'd fled to the United States after being brutally abused by her husband for years, beaten, kicked, burned with acid, punched so hard in the stomach when she was 8 months pregnant her child was born prematurely and with bruises. He told her it was pointless to go to the police because, quote, even the police and judges beat their wives. She did go to the authorities, who recommended she leave him, but when she did, he tracked her down, raped her, threatened to kill her. She then fled to the United States, where she finally won asylum. But on Monday, Attorney General Jeff Sessions overturned the precedent set in her case, ruling, quote, claims by aliens pertaining to domestic violence or gang violence perpetrated by non-governmental actors will not qualify for asylum, he said. Immigration lawyers have condemned the ruling, which could have sweeping effects not only for women fleeing domestic violence, but all people fleeing gang-based violence. Karen Musalo of the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies at the University of California Hastings College of Law said, quote, what this decision does is yank us all back to the dark ages of human rights and women's human rights, unquote. This comes as the Washington Post is reporting that the Honduran asylum seeker, who died by suicide after Border Patrol agents forcibly separated him from his 3-year-old child, had come to the United States with his family fleeing violence. The Honduran consulate says Marco Antonio Munoz and his family fled Honduras after Munoz's brother-in-law was murdered. After they arrived in the U.S., they voluntarily surrendered to Border Patrol agents and said they wanted to apply for asylum. But when agents told Munoz he would be separated from his 3-year-old son, he appears to have had a panic attack. The agents then ripped the boy out of his arms, transported Munoz to a Texas jail, where he was found dead by suicide the following morning. A newly published open letter signed by over 1,000 mental health professionals and organizations, has condemned the Trump administration's practice of separating children and parents at the border, writing, quote, we cannot afford to forget that there's a history of separating children from their parents during slave auctions, during the forced assimilation of American Indians, and during the Holocaust. To somehow convince ourselves that this systematic traumatization of children has no bearing on the lives of these children and no impact on the legacy of our country is to be living in an alternate universe. And to not care about the impact these policies have on these children is to succumb to the worst potential of humanity, the letter said. In a major voting rights case, the Supreme Court has ruled 5-4 to uphold Ohio's decision to aggressively purge voters from the rolls. The ruling allows Ohio to purge voters from the rolls if they haven't voted in recent elections and don't respond to a notice from election officials. A 2016 Reuters survey found nearly 150,000 people were removed from the voting rolls in recent years in Ohio's 3 largest counties alone. A handful of other states have similar voting laws. The ruling to uphold Ohio's decision to remove voters from the rolls is part of a nationwide battle over voter suppression efforts pushed by the Republican Party. On Monday, scores of people were arrested in front of the Supreme Court as part of a national day of action for the new Poor People's Campaign protesting poverty and racism. This is Reverend Dr. William Barber speaking at the rally just before he, too, was arrested.
How many of you understand how the Supreme Court justices get on the court? They get what? Nominated by who? President. And then they get what? By the Senate. How do senators get into office? Voting. So you understand why voting suppression is a labor issue? Yes. Voter suppression is not just a black issue, it's a labor issue, it's a poor people's issue. Because if you suppress the vote, you undermine the ability to elect people. And if you undermine the ability to elect people, you get people elected that will give you a regressive Supreme Court. So you can't separate voting rights from labor rights. It's not that the black folk over here fighting for voting rights and the white folk over here fighting for labor rights. We all better be fighting for all of our rights, every one of them.
9 religious leaders led by Reverend Liz Theoharis were arrested at the Supreme Court and have been held overnight in jail by Capitol Police. They were among dozens of people arrested in nationwide protests staging a moral revival 50 years after Martin Luther King Jr.'s original Poor People's Campaign. In downtown Boston, protesters blocked traffic to demand a higher minimum wage. In Olympia, Washington, activists erected tents to protest homelessness and unaffordable housing. In Sacramento, California, hundreds rallied outside the California Association of Realtors office to protest evictions. Monday's actions were part of the Poor People's Campaign's 5th week of nationwide protests, leading to a major march in Washington on June 23rd. The Washington Post is reporting President Trump's daughter, Ivanka, and her husband, Jared Kushner, both advisors to President Trump, raked in at least $82 million in outside income last year, even as both served as senior White House advisors. Ivanka Trump received nearly $4 million from her stake in the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C., $2 million from the Trump Organization, $5 million from the trust that oversees her clothing brand. Her husband, Jared Kushner, raked in a total of $70 million from dozens of companies tied to his family's real estate company, Kushner Companies. Ethics experts say the extraordinary income flow, while the two are serving as senior White House advisors, raises concerns about conflicts of interest. In Yemen, the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition bombed a new Doctors Without Borders cholera clinic in Yemen's northwest Abs region. Doctors Without Borders said that before the strike, the group had provided the coordinates of the clinic to the Saudi-led coalition and that the roof of the building clearly identified it as a medical site. The ongoing U.S.-backed Saudi-led war in Yemen has sparked the world's worst cholera epidemic, with more than 1 million people afflicted. This comes as the United Nations is warning an impending Saudi-led offensive on the Yemeni port city of Hodeidah could have catastrophic humanitarian consequences. This is Mark Lowcock, the UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs.
7 million people are completely reliant every month on food, and more than 7 million on other assistance from humanitarian organizations. So Hodeidah is absolutely central to the preserving of life. And if for any period Hodeidah were not to operate effectively, the consequences in humanitarian terms would be catastrophic.
The Wall Street Journal reports the Trump administration is weighing expanding its role in the war in Yemen by providing direct assistance to the impending Saudi-led offensive against that port city of Hodeidah. In Syria, the United Nations says nearly 1 million people were displaced inside Syria during the first 4 months of this year, the highest levels of internal displacement since the Syrian conflict began 7 years ago. In total, more than 6 million Syrians are displaced inside the country, with another 5.5 million Syrian refugees displaced outside Syria's borders. In Vietnam, police detained over 100 people protesting against proposed special economic zones amidst widespread demonstrations in recent days. The protests have forced lawmakers to postpone a vote on whether to approve a new law that would give foreign investors 99-year leases on land inside the special economic zones. The Spanish government has agreed to allow a boat carrying more than 600 refugees to dock in Valencia after Italy's new anti-immigrant government turned the boat away, leaving the hundreds of refugees stranded in the Mediterranean. The boat is carrying over 120 unaccompanied children and 7 pregnant women. In Italy, the mayor of Naples, Luigi De Magistris, condemned the Italian government's decision to reject the refugee boat.
The port of Naples is open. Whoever prevents a ship from docking in a port to save lives, whoever puts human lives at risk, not only behaves in an undignified, shameful, and ethically reprehensible way, but commits a crime against humanity and will be called to answer before international tribunals.
And the Department of Education has launched a federal investigation into the University of Southern California's handling of sexual abuse claims against the school's former gynecologist, Dr. George Tyndall. Authorities say school administrators receive reports of sexual abuse during pelvic exams dating back to the early 1990s, but failed to investigate these reports until 2016. Authorities say Dr. Tyndall may have seen 10,000 patients. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.